For most of my life, I learned to sit quietly at the edge of the table while praise was served to someone else. My parents called it pride. I felt it as absence. They adored my sister's ideal husband, the man with the polished smile, the loud success, the kind of confidence that filled a room before truth ever could. Next to him, my husband was treated like a mistake that needed explaining. No one asked how he slept at night. No one asked what he carried in silence. They only measured him by what he didn't show. I watched my parents' eyes light up for one man and harden for another. I listened to jokes that weren't jokes, comparisons that cut deep and lingered longer than words should. And through it all, my husband said almost nothing. I thought silence meant weakness. I was wrong. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the only one holding the truth. And when that truth finally comes out, slow, undeniable, and public, it doesn't just change opinions. It rewrites everything we thought we knew about respect, success, and justice. Before the story begins, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and late arriving justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I used to believe that favoritism was something obvious, something loud and undeniable. But in my family, it was quiet, wrapped in polite smiles and disguised as concern. We lived just outside Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood where everyone cared deeply about appearances. Clean sidewalks, neutral opinions, perfectly trimmed hedges. My parents fit right in. They were the kind of people who believed success could be measured, compared, and ranked. And in that ranking, my older sister Emily had always come first. Emily was 5 years older than me, and from childhood she carried herself like someone destined for admiration. She had straight A's, a natural confidence, and an ease with people that drew attention without effort. Teachers praised her, relatives bragged about her. My parents spoke her name with a pride that felt almost ceremonial. I, on the other hand, was the easy one. The child who didn't make trouble. The one who learned early that being agreeable kept the peace. As adults, that imbalance didn't disappear. It simply found new ways to express itself. Everything changed the day Emily introduced Ryan to the family. Ryan was polished in a way that immediately impressed my parents. He wore a tailored blazer, even to a casual dinner, and spoke with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. He talked about business ventures, expansion plans, and future goals in broad strokes that sounded impressive without revealing much. My father leaned forward when Ryan spoke, nodding along as if he were hearing something profound. My mother asked questions, genuinely interested, her eyes bright with approval. By the end of that first dinner, I could already tell Ryan had passed some invisible test. When Emily married him a year later, my parents called it a perfect match. They told friends and coworkers that their daughter had married an exceptional man. At church, my mother spoke about Ryan's career as if it were a reflection of her own success as a parent. Their pride was public and constant. I married Daniel 2 years after that. Daniel didn't arrive with the same shine. He didn't dominate conversations or tell stories designed to impress. He worked in regulatory compliance, reviewing internal processes, auditing reports, making sure companies followed laws most people never thought about. His job required patience, precision, and silence. It wasn't glamorous, and he never tried to make it sound like it was. When my father asked Daniel what he did for a living, Daniel explained it carefully, choosing words that wouldn't confuse or bore. My dad listened politely, then nodded once and said, "Well, someone's got to do that, I guess." That sentence set the tone for everything that followed. Family gatherings became subtle competitions Daniel never agreed to enter. At Sunday dinners, Ryan talked freely about projected earnings, potential partnerships, and upcoming opportunities he couldn't fully discuss yet. My parents listened intently, asking follow-up questions, hanging on every word. When Ryan finished speaking, my mother often smiled proudly and said, "Emily, you married so well." Daniel usually stayed quiet during these conversations. He cut his food neatly, occasionally glanced at me, and answered questions only when directly addressed. When asked about work, he gave honest, concise responses. No embellishment, no performance. The contrast was impossible to miss. My parents never openly insulted Daniel. Instead, they practiced a more refined cruelty comparison, disguised as concern. "Have you thought about encouraging Daniel to be more ambitious?" my mother asked me once while we were alone in the kitchen. Her tone was gentle, almost sympathetic. "He's such a nice man. I just worry he's too comfortable." Another time my father said Ryan really knows how to take risks. That's how you get ahead in this country. Then he glanced at Daniel, who was helping clear the table, and added, "Not everyone's built for that, though." Daniel heard those comments. I know he did. But he never reacted the way I expected him to. No anger, no defensiveness, just quiet acknowledgement as if he were filing each moment away. At first I thought his silence meant he didn't care. I was wrong. After one particularly tense holiday dinner where Ryan announced a new investment opportunity, and my parents practically applauded, I apologized to Daniel in the car. I told him I was embarrassed, hurt, angry on his behalf. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and said calmly, "They don't measure things the way I do." That answer unsettled me. I wanted him to fight, to prove them wrong, to demand respect. But Daniel never seemed interested in winning arguments that weren't worth having. Meanwhile, my parents' admiration for Ryan only grew. They began seeking his advice not just on finances, but on life decisions. They trusted him in ways they had never trusted Daniel. When Ryan suggested certain investments or business ideas, my parents listened closely. When Daniel raised quiet concerns or asked clarifying questions, they brushed them off. "You worry too much," my mother told him once. "Sometimes you have to trust people." Daniel nodded and said nothing. I started to doubt myself. Sitting at those dinners, watching my parents beam at Emily and Ryan, I felt small. I wondered if love really was supposed to look louder, more impressive. I questioned whether my definition of success was naive, whether I had chosen comfort over ambition. Late at night, when the house was quiet, those thoughts grew heavier. Daniel noticed. He always did. One evening, after my parents had made yet another comment about potential and settling, I finally broke down. I told him I felt like a disappointment, like my life by extension embarrassed my family. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he said softly, "People confuse visibility with value all the time. It doesn't mean they're right." I wanted to believe him. But years of subtle judgment are hard to unlearn. At that point, I didn't know what Daniel knew. I didn't know what he was quietly observing, or how carefully he was paying attention to the details everyone else ignored. I only knew that my family had chosen who they believed mattered, and it wasn't us. What I couldn't see yet was that this imbalance wasn't just emotional. It was laying the groundwork for something far more serious, something that would force my parents to confront the cost of their blind admiration. But for now, all I felt was the familiar ache of being overlooked, and the growing tension of a truth waiting patiently in the background. By the time spring arrived, my marriage had become an unspoken benchmark, something my parents measured against Emily's without ever admitting they were doing it. Every visit home felt like walking into an evaluation I hadn't agreed to take. The questions weren't cruel on the surface, but they carried weight. "So where do you see yourselves in 5 years?" my father asked one afternoon, while we sat on the back porch. Ryan answered questions like that with rehearsed confidence. He spoke about expansion, opportunity, scaling. Daniel answered differently. "I see stability," Daniel said. "Consistency. Enough to live without fear." My father smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that ended a conversation. Later, my mother pulled me aside and said, "He's very practical. I just wish he'd want more." More. That word followed me everywhere. My parents talked about marriage as if it were an investment portfolio. They admired growth, visibility, and returns. Emily's life fit that narrative perfectly. New house, new car, second baby on the way. Ryan seemed to embody everything my parents believed success should look like in America. Daniel didn't play that role. At family dinners, my parents began making comments that blurred the line between concern and ridicule. When Daniel mentioned he'd turned down a job offer because it involved relocating without clear contractual protections, my father laughed lightly. "You can't be scared of every risk," he said. "That's how people get stuck." Ryan nodded in agreement, adding, "You've got to bet on yourself sometimes." Daniel responded calmly, "I do. I just read the fine print first." The table went quiet for a moment. Then Ryan changed the subject and the conversation moved on as if Daniel's words hadn't mattered. I watched these exchanges carefully. Each one chipped away at something inside me, not my love for Daniel, but my sense of belonging in my own family. I felt like I was constantly explaining a decision no one wanted to understand. The worst moments came when my parents spoke about my marriage as if Daniel weren't present. One evening, while Daniel was outside taking a call, my mother leaned toward me and whispered, "You know, if things ever get hard, you don't have to stay just because you made a choice." I stared at her, stunned. "What do you mean, I just mean?" She continued gently. "Emily chose a man who could provide security. Ambition matters. Love isn't always enough." I didn't answer. I couldn't. That conversation replayed in my head for weeks afterward, especially when Daniel sat quietly beside me, unaware of how casually my parents questioned his worth. I wanted to confront them, to defend him openly, but every time I tried, the old patterns took over. My parents dismissed my feelings as sensitivity. They told me I was overreacting, that they just wanted the best for me. And somehow wanting the best never included trusting my judgment. Daniel sensed the tension. He always did. One night after another uncomfortable dinner, he asked me, "Do they think you made a mistake marrying me?" The question caught me off guard. It was the first time he'd ever voiced it so directly. I hesitated, then said quietly, "They think you could be more." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." There was no anger in his voice, just acceptance. That hurt more than any argument would have. As weeks passed, the comparisons became less subtle. My parents praised Ryan openly in front of Daniel as if trying to teach by example. "Ryan really understands leverage," my father said one evening. "That's why he's doing so well." Daniel didn't respond. He simply reached for his water and took a sip. Later, my mother said to me, "Emily never has to worry. That kind of man takes care of things." I looked at Daniel across the room, folding napkins neatly, and wondered how they could be so blind to the quiet strength sitting right in front of them. What my parents didn't see or chose not to see was how Daniel handled responsibility. He paid bills early. He tracked expenses meticulously. He planned for emergencies. He believed in preparation, not performance. But those traits didn't shine at dinner tables. They didn't come with stories or applause. And because Daniel didn't compete for attention, he lost by default. At home, I began to carry a constant knot of guilt. Guilt for not defending him loudly enough. Guilt for feeling embarrassed when my parents compared us to Emily and Ryan. Guilt for occasionally wishing Daniel would just speak up, prove them wrong, demand recognition. But Daniel never did. Instead, he spent long evenings reviewing documents on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I asked what he was working on, he said vaguely, "Just keeping an eye on things." "Things I asked once." "Patterns," he replied. I didn't press him. Part of me assumed it was work-related. Another part of me didn't want to know. Knowing might mean acknowledging that something was wrong beneath the surface of my parents' admiration. The tension reached a quiet peak the night my parents hosted a small gathering for close friends. Ryan was the star of the evening, holding court in the living room, talking about his latest venture. My parents watched him with pride, introducing him to everyone as our son-in-law, the entrepreneur. Daniel stood near the edge of the room, talking softly with a neighbor about gardening. No one introduced him. No one asked about his work. At one point, Ryan laughed and said loudly, "Some people are built to take risks. Others just like to play it safe." A few people chuckled. I felt heat rise to my face. Daniel heard it. I saw it in the slight tightening of his jaw. But he said nothing. He simply excused himself and stepped outside. That night on the drive home, I finally lost my composure. "I hate the way they treat you," I said, my voice shaking. "I hate that they act like you're less than." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "They're allowed to believe what they want." "That's not fair," I said. "No," he agreed calmly. "But fairness isn't always immediate." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't realize then that Daniel wasn't waiting for approval. He was waiting for timing. And while my parents continued to measure success by what was loud and visible, something was quietly shifting beneath the surface. I could feel it even if I didn't understand it yet. The pressure, the ridicule, the constant comparison, it was all building towards something. And soon, silence would no longer be enough to hold it back. The first signs that something was wrong didn't arrive like a warning siren. They came quietly, almost politely, the way uncomfortable truths often do. At first, they were just details that didn't quite line up small enough to ignore if you weren't looking closely. I wasn't looking closely. Daniel was. It started with a conversation I overheard by accident. Emily had called my parents one evening while Daniel and I were visiting. I was in the kitchen pretending not to listen when I heard Ryan's name followed by numbers. Large numbers. Investment figures. Timelines. My mother's voice was anxious but excited the way it gets when hope and fear mix together. Later that night, I asked Daniel if he knew what they were talking about. "Ryan's new venture," he said simply. "You sound like you already know," I replied. "I know enough," he said, then added to be careful. That word careful felt out of place in a family that worshipped confidence. I shrugged it off, telling myself Daniel was just being cautious like always. But over the next few weeks, more fragments surfaced. Ryan began talking about his business more aggressively. He mentioned rapid growth, private investors, and legal structures he described vaguely. When asked for specifics, he deflected with charm. My parents didn't push. They trusted him completely. Daniel noticed what others didn't, the way Ryan avoided direct answers, the way timelines shifted slightly from one conversation to the next, the way certain terms were used incorrectly, small mistakes, but meaningful to someone who understood compliance and regulation. One evening after another family dinner, Daniel said quietly as we drove home, "Some of the things he's describing don't work the way he says they do." I felt my chest tighten. "Are you saying he's lying?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied carefully, "that the story changes depending on who's listening." I didn't want to hear it. Not because I doubted Daniel, but because acknowledging the possibility meant facing something much bigger. My parents had built their pride around Ryan. Admitting he might be flawed felt almost dangerous. Daniel didn't push. He never did. Instead, he began asking questions, subtle ones. When Ryan talked about contracts, Daniel asked about clauses. When Ryan mentioned partnerships, Daniel asked about filings. Ryan always smiled, always deflected, always promised to explain later. Later never came. I watched Daniel during these conversations. He didn't challenge Ryan directly. He listened. He remembered. And afterward, at home, he wrote things down. Dates, numbers, phrases that didn't match. "What are you doing?" I asked one night as he typed quietly at the kitchen table. "Organizing," he said. "For what? In case clarity becomes necessary." That answer unsettled me. It suggested patience but also inevitability. Around that time, my parents announced they were considering a significant financial commitment to Ryan's venture. They framed it as support, as belief in family. My mother spoke about it with excitement. My father talked about returns and legacy. Daniel asked to see the paperwork. The room went cold. Ryan laughed it off. "It's all standard stuff," he said. "Pretty boring, actually." Daniel smiled politely. "That's exactly why I'd like to look at it." My parents exchanged glances. My mother frowned slightly. "Do we really need to complicate this?" she asked. "We trust Ryan." Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. "Of course. I was just offering." Later, my father pulled me aside. "Daniel's a bit paranoid," he said. "Not everything needs to be dissected." That word paranoid stung. It turned caution into weakness, integrity into suspicion. I wanted to scream that asking questions wasn't an attack, that reading contracts wasn't a lack of faith, but the old reflex kicked in again. I stayed quiet. I kept the peace. Daniel noticed my silence too. That night he said gently, "You don't have to choose sides." "I feel like I already have," I admitted. He looked at me for a long moment. "Then let me carry the weight. You don't have to." As weeks passed, Ryan's confidence grew bolder. He spoke as if the deal were already done. He made plans with my parents' money before anything was finalized. My mother bragged to friends. My father adjusted his retirement projections. Daniel grew quieter. He started spending more time reviewing public records, filings, and legal databases. He never told me everything. He found only pieces. Enough to worry me, not enough to overwhelm me. "There are gaps," he said once. "Things that should exist but don't." I asked him if we should warn my parents more forcefully. He shook his head. "They won't hear it yet." That word again. Yet. The tension came to a head one Sunday afternoon when my parents invited us over to celebrate progress. Ryan was there, relaxed and triumphant. He spoke about closing dates and next steps. My parents beamed. Daniel listened carefully. When Ryan finished, Daniel asked one question, just one. "Who's the compliance officer on this?" Ryan hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Oh, that's outsourced," he said quickly. "Standard practice." Daniel nodded, to whom Ryan laughed. "You really love details, don't you?" My parents chuckled along, eager to move on. But something had shifted. I could feel it. Ryan's confidence flickered just briefly. Daniel saw it too. On the drive home, Daniel exhaled slowly. "That hesitation mattered," he said. I didn't respond. My mind was racing. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every dismissal, every time my parents chose admiration over scrutiny. I realized then that Daniel hadn't been quiet because he was weak. He'd been quiet because he was waiting for facts. And facts, unlike opinions, don't need to be loud to be devastating. I didn't know when the truth would surface, or how public it would become. I only knew that something was coming, something my parents weren't prepared for, something Ryan had underestimated. And for the first time I understood that Daniel's silence wasn't passive. It was strategic. By the time my parents officially decided to invest in Ryan's venture, the atmosphere in our family had shifted from admiration to near reverence. Ryan wasn't just my sister's husband anymore, he had become an authority figure. Someone whose opinions carried weight simply because my parents believed in him so completely. They called it faith. Daniel called it exposure. The decision was announced over dinner, framed as a celebration. My mother brought out a bottle of wine she'd been saving for something important. My father cleared his throat and spoke with a seriousness usually reserved for major life events. "We've decided to support Ryan's company," he said. Significantly. Ryan smiled, modest and confident all at once. Emily squeezed his hand, her pride unmistakable. I waited for Daniel to say something, to object, to warn them one last time. Instead, he simply asked, "Have the contracts been finalized?" My father waved the question away. "We're in the final stages. It's a family matter. We don't need to overthink it." That was the moment I understood logic had already lost. The amount my parents invested wasn't small. It represented years of careful saving retirement funds and a portion of the equity from their home. When I heard the number 6 figures, I felt my stomach drop. Daniel asked calmly to review the documents before anything was signed. Ryan laughed lightly. "You don't need to worry about that stuff," he said. "I've got it handled." My mother added, "Ryan's done this before. He knows what he's doing." Daniel nodded once and said nothing more. After dinner in the car, I finally broke. "They're risking everything," I said. "And they won't listen to you." "They're making a choice," Daniel replied. "I can't force them to make a different one." "But you know something's wrong," I insisted. "Yes," he said quietly. "And that's why I'm documenting everything." From that point on, my parents treated Daniel differently. Not openly hostile, but distant. Suspicious. They stopped asking his opinion altogether. When he raised concerns, they brushed them aside more quickly than before. Ryan, meanwhile, leaned into his role. He began directing conversations, suggesting financial moves, and even advising my parents on legal decisions unrelated to the investment. They followed his lead without question. Daniel observed it all in silence. At home, our evenings changed. Daniel spent hours reviewing public filings, tracking inconsistencies, and cross-referencing timelines. I watched him work, torn between fear and trust. I wanted to believe my parents would be okay. I wanted to believe Ryan wasn't capable of what Daniel seemed to suspect, but the evidence kept piling up. "There are misrepresentations," Daniel said one night. "Things he's saying don't match what's filed." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," he replied carefully, "that someone's being misled." Not long after, the family tension reached a breaking point. My parents invited us over again, this time to sign additional paperwork documents Ryan described as formalities. Daniel asked to review them before they were signed. Ryan's smile tightened. "Why do you always need to complicate things?" Emily snapped. "Can't you just trust my husband?" Daniel looked at her calmly. "Trust and verification aren't opposites." That was the first time Emily had ever spoken to him with open hostility. My father stood up from the table. "That's enough," he said sharply. "This is between us and Ryan. If you can't be supportive, maybe you shouldn't be involved at all." The words hit harder than I expected. Daniel didn't argue. He gathered his coat and stood. "We'll leave," he said quietly. As we walked out, I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was grief. Grief for a family that no longer felt safe. Grief for the respect that had never truly existed. From that night on, communication with my parents became strained. They stopped calling regularly. When they did, the conversations were brief and guarded. Emily barely spoke to me at all. Ryan, however, continued to update them enthusiastically on his progress. Daniel continued working. Weeks later, I noticed something different in Daniel's demeanor. Not urgency, but resolve. "I've seen this pattern before," he said one evening. "It starts with charm, then control, then silence." "What happens next?" I asked. "Public exposure," he replied. I shivered at the word. I didn't want a scandal. I didn't want my family dragged through something ugly. But I could see now that the path they were on didn't offer gentle endings. The first real consequence came unexpectedly. One afternoon, my father called me, his voice tight. "There's been a delay," he said. "Ryan says it's nothing, but some funds are temporarily inaccessible." Daniel listened on speakerphone. He didn't react. After the call, he said, "That was predictable." More delays followed. Excuses, revised timelines. Ryan's confidence began to sound rehearsed rather than assured. My parents grew anxious but still defended him fiercely. "They're just bumps," my mother insisted. "All businesses have them." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he began preparing. He organized files, printed records, and highlighted inconsistencies. I watched him work with a calm intensity that scared me more than anger ever could. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. Yet, the breaking point came during a family gathering that was supposed to smooth things over. Ryan spoke again about future returns, trying to reassure everyone. My parents nodded along, desperate to believe him. Daniel waited until Ryan finished. Then he said quietly, "Some of these representations could be considered misleading." The room went silent. Ryan stared at him. "Excuse me," Daniel met his gaze. "I'm saying there are discrepancies between what you're telling them and what's legally documented." Emily stood up, furious. "You're trying to sabotage us." My father's face reddened. "You've crossed a line." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "I'm stating facts." My parents asked him to leave. That night, as we drove home in silence, I realized something important. Daniel had stopped trying to protect their feelings. He was now protecting the truth, and the truth, once spoken, doesn't disappear. It waits. It gathers weight. Soon it would demand a stage. After that night, we were no longer just overlooked, we were unwelcome. The silence from my parents wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calculated. Calls stopped coming. Texts went unanswered. Invitations quietly disappeared. When I reached out, my messages were met with polite, delayed responses that felt rehearsed, as if every word had been approved by someone else before being sent. Emily didn't respond at all. It was as if questioning Ryan had placed us outside the family perimeter. Support, I learned, was conditional. Loyalty had limits, and once you crossed them, you became a liability. Daniel took it in stride, at least on the surface. He didn't complain or ask me to choose. He didn't replay the arguments or dissect what had been said. Instead, he turned inward, focused, deliberate. He went to work, came home, and spent evenings reviewing documents with a patience that felt almost unsettling. I tried to pretend everything was normal. I went to work. I made dinner. I folded laundry. But there was a constant pressure in my chest, a sense that we were standing just outside a storm, waiting for it to notice us. One night, I asked Daniel the question I'd been avoiding. "Why don't you just tell them everything you know?" He didn't answer right away. He closed his laptop and looked at me, really looked at me as if weighing something. "Because he said finally they wouldn't hear it." "Not yet. That's what you keep saying," I replied, frustration creeping into my voice. "When is yet?" "When they need facts more than reassurance," he said. "Right now they're still choosing comfort." I hated how calm he was, how certain. It made me feel like I was the only one panicking. The isolation took a toll on me. I missed my parents. I missed my sister. Even knowing how unfairly they'd treated Daniel, part of me still wanted their approval. That old ache hadn't disappeared, it had just been buried under anger. Daniel noticed my restlessness. "You don't have to cut them off," he said one evening. "If you want to keep trying, I understand." "I don't want to betray you," I said. He shook his head. "You wouldn't be. Truth doesn't need loyalty tests." That was Daniel, never forcing a choice, never demanding allegiance, and somehow that made my loyalty to him stronger. As weeks passed, cracks in Ryan's story became harder to ignore. My parents called occasionally, no longer celebratory, now cautious. They spoke in careful phrases as if afraid of saying the wrong thing out loud. Ryan had explanations for everything. Delays were temporary. Issues were procedural. Lawyers were involved. He sounded confident, but something in his tone had changed. The ease was gone. Daniel listened to these updates without comment. Behind the scenes, he was building something I didn't fully understand yet. He requested public records. He reviewed filings and amendments. He compared timelines Ryan had mentioned at dinners with the dates on official documents. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that wasn't about bad luck or market conditions. It was about misrepresentation. "There are omissions," Daniel told me one night. "Important ones." "What kind?" I asked. "The kind that matter when money changes hands," he replied. I felt sick. One afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded strained, older somehow. "Do you know anything about what's going on with Ryan's company?" she asked. I hesitated. "What do you mean? There are complications," she said. "Ryan says it's under control." I glanced at Daniel, who was sitting across the room listening quietly. He gave me a small nod. "I think you should ask for documentation," I said carefully. "In writing." There was a pause on the line. Daniel's been putting ideas in your head, my mother said. The accusation hurt more than I expected. No, I replied. I'm asking you to protect yourself. She sighed. We trust Ryan. After the call ended, I broke down. The frustration, the fear, the helplessness, it all poured out. Daniel held me without saying a word, his presence steady and grounding. They're going to get hurt, I whispered. Yes, he said softly. But not because of us. Soon after, the distancing became official. My parents informed me through Emily that they needed space, that they didn't want negativity during such an important time, that our skepticism was harmful. Daniel read the message once and handed my phone back to me. They're choosing a narrative, he said. Let them have it for now. That phrase for now echoed in my head. The turning point came quietly. No dramatic announcement. Just a notice buried in a public docket that Daniel happened to find late one night. He stared at the screen for a long time before calling me over. This changes things, he said. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding. A discrepancy in reported assets, he replied. And it's not small. I didn't fully understand the technical details, but I understood the implication. Something had been presented as solid that wasn't. Something my parents had relied on didn't exist in the way they'd been told. What do we do? I asked. Daniel closed his laptop. We wait. For what? For it to become public, he said. This won't stay contained. In the weeks that followed, pressure mounted. Ryan became harder to reach. His updates grew vague. My parents' calls became more frequent and more desperate. They still defended him, but the certainty was gone. Daniel began preparing a file organized, meticulous, undeniable. He included dates, figures, statements, everything sourced, everything verifiable. What is that for? I asked. For when someone finally asks the right questions, he said. I realized then that Daniel wasn't acting out of resentment. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong or humiliate anyone. He was preparing for accountability, for a moment when truth would be required, not optional. The distance from my family hurt deeply. There were days I wanted to give in, apologize, pretend we'd been wrong, to trade truth for peace. But every time that thought crossed my mind, I looked at Daniel, steady, composed, unwavering, and I knew I couldn't. He wasn't fighting. He was waiting. And waiting, I learned, can be its own form of strength. By the end of that summer, it was clear something was coming. The questions were growing louder, the explanations thinner, the silence around Ryan heavier. My parents didn't know it yet, but the space they'd created between us, the exclusion, the dismissal, the refusal to listen, was about to collapse under the weight of facts they could no longer ignore. And when that happened, there would be no way to keep it private. The moment everything began to unravel didn't happen at home or around a dinner table. It happened in a place no one could control, a place built for records, questions, and witnesses. The notice came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. My phone buzzed while I was getting ready for work. It was a message from my mother, short and urgent. Are you with Daniel? Please call me. Before I could respond, Daniel's phone rang. He answered quietly, listened for a long moment, then put it on speaker. A woman introduced herself as an attorney, representing a group of investors connected to Ryan's company. She spoke calmly, professionally, and with the kind of precision that leaves no room for interpretation. There would be a formal review. Certain parties might be asked to provide documentation. Attendance would be required. When the call ended, the apartment felt too quiet. This is it, I said. Daniel nodded. This is where things become public. Within days, the situation escalated faster than I expected. What my parents had been treating as a private family matter was now part of a broader inquiry. There were emails, notices, requests for information. The kind of language that sounds neutral but carries serious weight. Ryan stopped returning calls altogether. Emily finally reached out to me, not with an apology, but with anger. Why is this happening? She demanded over the phone. What did you do? I didn't do anything, I said, my voice steady despite the accusation. This isn't about us. She scoffed. Of course it is. Daniel never liked Ryan. That's not true, I replied. He just asked questions. The line went dead. A week later, my parents were summoned to attend a preliminary hearing related to the investment. It wasn't a trial. Not yet, but it was formal, public, documented. They asked Daniel to come with them. It was the first time they'd asked for his help without qualification. We met them outside the federal building downtown. The structure was imposing gray stone, tall steps, flags waving in the wind. As we approached, I could see the tension on my parents' faces. The confidence they once carried was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. Ryan wasn't there. Neither was Emily. Inside the room was stark and functional. Rows of chairs, a long table at the front, attorneys flipping through folders. When my parents saw the number of people present, other investors, legal representatives, a few reporters lingering quietly in the back, I watched realization settle in. This wasn't small, and it wasn't private. Daniel sat beside us, calm and composed. He didn't speak unless spoken to. When asked for information, he provided it clearly without emotion. He handed over documents he'd prepared months earlier, records, timelines, inconsistencies laid out methodically. The attorney reviewing them paused more than once, her brow furrowing as she read. "These discrepancies," she said, finally looking up, "are significant." My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The questions came steadily. Who had presented what? When certain statements were made? What documentation had been provided at the time of investment? Daniel answered precisely. My parents struggled. At one point, the attorney asked, "Were you aware that certain assets described in these presentations were not reflected in official filings?" My father hesitated. "We trusted our son-in-law." The attorney nodded. "Trust is not documentation." That sentence landed heavily in the room. When the session ended, we stepped back outside into the sunlight. My mother looked stunned. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him. Daniel remained quiet. The story moved quickly after that. Requests turned into subpoenas. The inquiry expanded. Ryan's name began appearing in places he couldn't charm his way out of. Regulators became involved. What had started as a family investment issue was now a matter of compliance and potential fraud. And still, Ryan stayed silent. The next major development came with a formal hearing scheduled at a larger venue open to the public. Daniel explained it carefully. "This is where evidence is entered into record," he said. "Statements are examined." "Is this a trial?" my mother asked. "Not yet," Daniel replied. "But it leads there." The day of the hearing, the room was full. Investors, attorneys, observers, a few journalists taking notes. I sat between Daniel and my parents, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. When Ryan finally entered, the air shifted. He looked different, still well-dressed but strained. The easy confidence was gone. He avoided eye contact with everyone, including Emily, who sat rigidly a few rows back. The proceedings were formal and methodical. Statements were read, timelines established, documents projected onto screens for everyone to see. Each discrepancy Daniel had quietly documented was now displayed publicly, stripped of spin and performance. Ryan's attorney spoke on his behalf, attempting to frame the issues as misunderstandings, market shifts, administrative delays. But the documents told a different story. Then Daniel was called to speak not as an accuser but as a witness. He stood, straightened his jacket, and approached the podium. He didn't look at Ryan. He looked at the panel. He explained his background briefly, his experience in compliance, his familiarity with regulatory standards. Then he walked them through the timeline calmly, clearly, without judgment. At one point, a panel member asked, "Why didn't you raise these concerns earlier directly?" Daniel answered honestly, "I did, privately, repeatedly. And when they weren't addressed, I documented." The simplicity of that response was powerful. Ryan finally looked up then. His expression flickered something between anger and fear. When Daniel finished, the room was silent. The panel thanked him. I glanced at my parents. My mother's eyes were wet. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The hearing ended without dramatic declarations, but the damage was done. The truth was now part of the public record. It could no longer be ignored, minimized, or explained away at family dinners. Outside, reporters approached, asking questions. My parents declined to comment. Ryan was escorted out through a side exit. On the drive home, no one spoke for a long time. "Finally," my mother whispered. "He was right." Daniel didn't respond. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something profound had shifted. The power dynamic in my family, the one that had favored charm over substance, noise over integrity, had cracked. The man they once ridiculed had spoken the truth in the one place it mattered. And this was only the beginning. If Part 7 was the unraveling, Part 8 was the exposure, the moment when power changed hands without anyone raising their voice. The hearing had shaken my parents, but it hadn't fully broken their denial. Not yet. On the drive home, my father said very little. My mother kept repeating, "This isn't what we were told," as if the repetition alone could rewrite what had just happened. Emily didn't call. Ryan didn't explain. Silence wrapped itself around our family like a heavy fog. Daniel didn't say, "I warned you." He didn't say anything at all. What he did instead was continue cooperating. Quietly. Precisely. He responded to every request for clarification, every follow-up question from attorneys and regulators. He treated the process with the same respect he treated his work. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. A week later, the situation escalated again. This time it wasn't an email or a notice. It was a formal summons for a compliance review meeting involving multiple parties, investors, legal representatives, and federal regulators. My parents were required to attend. Ryan was required to attend. Daniel was requested. The meeting took place in a large conference room inside a federal office building. Fluorescent lights, long tables arranged in a rectangle, nameplates set carefully in front of each seat, the kind of environment where posturing dies quickly. Ryan arrived late. That alone would have meant nothing in any other context, but here it mattered. Heads turned. Notes were made. Daniel noticed. I noticed. The meeting began with an overview from a federal compliance officer, measured, unemotional, devastating in its clarity. She outlined the scope of the review, the nature of the discrepancies, and the legal standards involved. She spoke about fiduciary duty, material misrepresentation, and investor protection as if reading from a textbook. There was no accusation in her tone. That made it worse. Ryan's attorney attempted to redirect the conversation toward intent, toward misunderstanding, toward complexity. The officer stopped him. "Intent is determined later," she said. "Right now we're establishing facts." Then she turned to Daniel. "Mr. Harris," she said, "you submitted documentation that identified inconsistencies prior to public inquiry. Can you explain your methodology?" Daniel explained it step by step. How he tracked statements, how he compared them to filings, how he noted omissions, how he preserved records. No embellishment, no commentary, just process. Ryan shifted in his seat. At one point, the officer asked Ryan directly, "Can you provide documentation to support this asset valuation?" Ryan hesitated. "I'd need time to gather it," he said. The officer nodded. "You've had time." The room went quiet. My parents sat frozen. I could see the exact moment when belief collapsed into realization. The man they had worshipped, defended, and trusted without question was now being asked to prove what he had always claimed, and he couldn't. Emily stared at the table. The meeting continued for hours. Each section peeled back another layer. Funds moved without disclosure. Timelines adjusted retroactively. Statements that had been presented as facts but lacked documentation. Daniel was asked questions throughout, not as a suspect, but as a reference point. And that was the shift. The power in the room didn't belong to Ryan anymore. It belonged to the process, to the paper trail, to the quiet man who had been dismissed because he didn't perform success loudly enough. When the meeting ended, the compliance officer concluded with a statement that landed like a verdict, even though it wasn't one. "Based on what we've reviewed today," she said, "there is sufficient cause for continued investigation." Ryan's attorney asked about next steps. "Enforcement will determine that," she replied. Outside, the atmosphere was tense. Ryan avoided everyone's eyes. Emily followed him without a word. My parents lingered behind, visibly shaken. My father finally turned to Daniel. "You knew," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Daniel nodded. "I suspected. Then I confirmed." "Why didn't you stop us?" my mother asked, her voice breaking. Daniel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was gentle but firm. "I tried," he said. "But you didn't want facts. You wanted reassurance." My mother covered her mouth. My father looked down at the ground. That was the first apology. Not spoken, but understood. In the days that followed, the story spread. Not in tabloids or headlines, but in legal circles, business communities, and quietly among the people who mattered. Ryan's image began to fracture. His calls went unanswered. His confidence evaporated. Emily stopped returning messages. Daniel remained steady. He went to work. He came home. He answered questions when asked. He didn't seek recognition or vindication. He didn't celebrate. One evening, my parents came to our apartment unannounced. They looked smaller than I remembered. "We were wrong," my father said. "About everything." Daniel listened. My mother's voice trembled. "We judged you. We thought success had a look, a sound." Daniel nodded. "A lot of people do." "We trusted the wrong person," she whispered. Daniel didn't argue. That night, after they left, I asked him how he felt. Tired, he said honestly. But clear. Clear. That was the word. The investigation continued. There were more hearings to come, more consequences unfolding behind the scenes. But something essential had already changed. The truth had taken center stage, and it hadn't needed theatrics to do it. The man my parents once ridiculed had become the anchor in the storm, not because he demanded power, but because he understood it. And for the first time in a long time, my family was being forced to see the difference between admiration and integrity. Once the investigation moved forward, there was no way to contain the truth anymore. What had been whispered behind closed doors began to solidify into an undeniable narrative. One built not on opinions or family loyalties, but on documents, timestamps, and numbers that refused to change no matter who looked at them. Ryan's story unraveled piece by piece. The regulators didn't announce conclusions immediately. Instead, they released findings incrementally, each one tightening the circle. Asset valuations that had been presented as solid were revealed to be projections with no supporting evidence. Partnerships Ryan had described as confirmed were in reality informal conversations that never progressed beyond emails. Funds that were meant to be restricted had been moved freely without disclosure. Each revelation landed like a quiet blow. My parents tried to keep up. They asked questions now, the kind they had dismissed months earlier. They called Daniel frequently, their tone cautious, almost deferential. He answered every question honestly, never once reminding them how often he'd been ignored. Emily, on the other hand, disappeared. For weeks, she didn't respond to messages or calls. When she finally did reach out, it wasn't to apologize or explain. It was to defend. "You don't know the whole story," she insisted during a tense phone call. "People are twisting things." Daniel listened on speakerphone, his expression unreadable. "Then the documentation will show that," he said calmly. Emily's voice rose. "You always wanted to be right." That accusation hurt more than I expected. It framed truth as ego, integrity as competition. "This isn't about being right," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about what's real." She hung up on me. The full scope of the situation became clear during a comprehensive review session held several weeks later. This time, it wasn't just regulators and attorneys. It was accountants, compliance specialists, and independent auditors. They walked through the case methodically, presenting findings in a way that left little room for interpretation. Daniel was present again, not as a hero, not as an accuser, but as a reference, someone who had flagged issues early and preserved evidence. One of the auditors addressed the room. "There is a consistent pattern of misrepresentation," she said. "Statements made to investors do not align with verifiable records." Ryan sat rigidly beside his attorney. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. My parents listened in silence, each sentence carving deeper into their understanding. I could see the weight of it settling in the recognition that this wasn't bad luck or misunderstanding. It was deception. After the session, my father pulled Daniel aside. "You saw this coming," he said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "And you still didn't turn your back on us." Daniel met his eyes. "Your family." That word family felt heavier than it ever had before. The legal consequences followed swiftly after that. Accounts were frozen. Additional reviews were ordered. Ryan's company ceased operations pending investigation. The lifestyle my parents had admired, the cars, the confidence, the promises collapsed under scrutiny. Emily finally came to see me in person. She looked exhausted, older. The certainty that once defined her was gone. "I didn't know," she said, sitting across from me in our living room. "I swear, I believed her. Or at least I believed she hadn't wanted to know." Daniel stayed in the kitchen, giving us space. "I defended him because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd been wrong," Emily continued. "And Mom and Dad, they needed him to be perfect." I nodded, tears in my eyes. "So did you." She swallowed hard. What happens now? I didn't have an answer. What happened next unfolded slowly in paperwork and proceedings rather than dramatic confrontations. Ryan faced formal charges related to fraud and misrepresentation. His name became associated not with ambition, but with cautionary tales. My parents lost money. Not all of it, but enough to force them to reconsider their plans, their assumptions, their trust. They grieved not just the financial loss, but the illusion they had clung to. Through it all, Daniel remained unchanged. He never raised his voice, never gloated, never used the moment to assert superiority. When asked why he had been so patient, he gave the same answer every time. "Because truth doesn't expire. One evening, weeks after the charges became public, my parents invited us over for dinner. It was the first time since everything had come apart. The house felt different, quieter, humbler. During the meal, my father cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said to Daniel. "I judged you by what I thought mattered. I was wrong." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." My mother reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. "You protected us even when we didn't deserve it." Daniel didn't pull away. "You protected yourselves by listening." Eventually, that was the closest he came to acknowledgement. Later that night, as we drove home, I realized something important. The truth hadn't just exposed Ryan. It had exposed our family's values. Our willingness to overlook substance for spectacle. Our tendency to reward confidence over character. Daniel had never asked for validation. He didn't need it. But now the same people who once ridiculed him deferred to his judgment without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The truth, when fully revealed, doesn't shout. It simply stands there, unmovable, waiting for everyone else to catch up. And once they do, nothing is ever the same again. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, legal, financial, emotional, each one reshaping my family in ways we couldn't undo. Ryan's arrest didn't make headlines the way people imagine. There were no flashing lights outside the house, no dramatic perp walk. It happened quietly early one morning, through attorneys and formal notices. By the time most people found out, it was already a matter of record. Charges filed, accounts frozen, a court date scheduled. Emily called me that night. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. Her voice sounded hollow, like someone speaking from a room she hadn't fully entered yet. "They say he misrepresented everything," she said. "That the numbers were inflated. That some assets never existed." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry." There was a long pause. "I built my life on him," she whispered. That sentence lingered with me long after the call ended. For my parents, the consequences were immediate and unforgiving. Their retirement plans collapsed overnight. Money they had counted on, money they had spoken about with pride, was suddenly tied up in legal proceedings. Some of it would be recovered. Some of it wouldn't. The certainty they once lived with evaporated. They stopped talking about numbers altogether. What replaced it was silence. Long, reflective silence. The kind that forces people to sit with their own choices. They leaned on Daniel more now, asked his opinion before making decisions, showed him documents before signing anything. The shift was so complete it almost felt uncomfortable. Not because Daniel resisted it, but because of how easily it had happened once admiration was stripped away from the wrong person. Daniel handled it with the same restraint he always had. He helped them review options. He explained processes. He answered questions patiently, even when they were asked repeatedly, as if repetition might soften the truth. One afternoon, my father asked him, "Why didn't you ever push harder?" Daniel considered the question. "Because people hear pressure as hostility," he said. "I didn't want you to confuse concern with attack." My father nodded slowly. "We already did." Emily moved out of the house she'd shared with Ryan, the one my parents had once praised endlessly. It went on the market, stripped of its furniture and illusion. I visited her once during the move. She sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, staring at nothing. "I feel like I failed everyone," she said quietly. I sat beside her. "You believed someone you loved." She shook her head. "No. I believed the version of him that made me look successful." That honesty startled me. The legal process moved forward methodically. Hearings, filings, statements. Daniel wasn't involved beyond what was required, but his early documentation played a significant role. His name appeared in reports not as a whistleblower, not as an accuser, but as someone who had flagged risks responsibly and early. When my parents saw that, something shifted again. One evening, my mother said to me, "We taught you to be quiet, to endure." And somehow Daniel learned how to do it better than we ever understood. I didn't know how to respond. The apology came later. Not in one dramatic moment, but in fragments. Acknowledgments slipped into conversations, regrets expressed without being asked. My parents didn't excuse themselves. They didn't justify their favoritism. They simply admitted it. "We were dazzled," my father said one night, "and we mistook dazzle for substance." Daniel listened, hands folded, eyes steady. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I needed you to listen." "We know," my mother replied. "Too late." "Not too late," Daniel corrected gently. "Just later than you wanted." That was Daniel's way, never cruel, never triumphant. Publicly, Ryan's image collapsed entirely. Former associates distanced themselves. The charm that once protected him became irrelevant in courtrooms and filings. Emily stopped defending him. She focused instead on rebuilding her life piece by piece. For me, the strangest part was the reversal. The same family dinners that once left me shrinking now felt different. When Daniel spoke, people listened. When he stayed silent, they waited. Respect had replaced ridicule, not because he demanded it, but because it could no longer be denied. Yet Daniel didn't seem changed by it. One night, as we washed dishes together after dinner at my parents' house, I asked him if it felt satisfying. "What?" he asked. "Being right," I said. He paused, then smiled faintly. "I wasn't aiming for that." "Then what were you aiming for?" He dried his hands slowly. "For this to end without destroying everyone." I looked at him, really looked at him. At the man my parents had once dismissed as unambitious, at the man who had stood quietly while being underestimated. He had never needed their approval. But now that he had their respect, he carried it lightly as if it were never the point. The family wasn't healed. Not yet. There were still awkward conversations, unresolved resentment, financial uncertainty. But the hierarchy had dissolved. The pedestal was gone. What remained was something more honest. And for the first time, I felt like I could stand in my family without apologizing for the life I'd chosen or the man I'd married. The cost of admiration without scrutiny had been high. But the lesson it left behind was unmistakable. The person who saves you rarely looks like the one you celebrate. If part 10 was about consequences, then part 11 was about what remained after the noise faded. The court proceedings continued in the background, moving at the slow, deliberate pace of the legal system. Dates were set, filings submitted, outcomes anticipated but not yet finalized. By then, the shock had worn off. What lingered instead was something quieter and more difficult to navigate: shame, grief, and the uneasy work of rebuilding trust. My parents changed in ways I didn't expect. They stopped talking about success entirely. No more comparisons. No more stories about who was doing better, earning more, rising, faster. When neighbors asked polite questions about Emily and Ryan, my mother answered briefly and changed the subject. The pride she once carried like armor had softened into humility. They also started asking questions they had never asked before. "How do you feel about your work?" my father asked Daniel one evening, genuinely curious. Daniel thought for a moment. "I feel responsible," he said. "I make sure people don't get hurt by what they don't see." My father nodded slowly. "That matters." That single sentence felt heavier than any apology. Emily's transformation was slower and more painful. She went through phases: anger, denial, self-blame. Some days she spoke as if Ryan had tricked everyone. Other days, she spoke as if she should have known. I listened without judgment, remembering how fiercely she had once defended him. One afternoon, while we sat together in a quiet cafe, she said, "I hated how small I felt next to you." The confession startled me. "You were always so certain," she continued. "So steady. And I thought marrying someone impressive would make me feel secure." I looked at her across the table. "Did it?" She shook her head. "It made me feel borrowed." That honesty was new, raw, unpolished. As for Daniel, he became something of a reference point in the family, not an authority, but a compass. My parents asked him to review documents. Emily asked for advice when she considered going back to school. Even extended relatives, once quick to praise Ryan, now approached Daniel with quiet respect. It was surreal. But Daniel never leaned into it. He didn't enjoy being consulted. He simply answered when asked, declined when appropriate, and returned to his life without ceremony. One evening, after another family dinner, I asked him if it bothered him that it took disaster for everyone to see him clearly. He considered the question carefully. "No," he said. "People see what they're ready to see." That answer stayed with me. The most difficult moment came unexpectedly months later when the court issued a preliminary ruling. Ryan would face significant penalties. Emily was legally separated by then, her voice steady as she told me over the phone. "I feel relieved," she admitted, "and ashamed for feeling that way." "You're allowed to feel relieved," I said. "So are Mom and Dad," she replied quietly. "They just don't know how yet." Healing didn't arrive as a single event. It came in fragments: shared meals without tension, conversations without defensiveness, silences that felt peaceful instead of heavy. My parents apologized again, this time without qualifiers. "We didn't just favor Emily," my mother said one night. "We diminished you. And we misjudged your husband." Daniel listened, then said gently, "You don't owe me anything. Just don't repeat it." My father nodded. "We won't." Whether that promise would hold forever, I didn't know, but it was real in that moment. What surprised me most was how little Daniel needed from any of it. He didn't seek validation. He didn't revisit old wounds. He didn't even seem particularly changed by the respect he now received. He had always known who he was. One night, as we walked through our neighborhood, I asked him why he had stayed so quiet all those years. Why he hadn't fought back when my parents ridiculed him. He stopped walking and looked at me. Because if I had fought them, he said they would have fought me back. And then the truth would have become about winning. I nodded slowly. I wanted it to be about facts, he continued. Facts don't need defending. That was when I understood the full measure of his strength. It wasn't patience for patience's sake. It was discipline. A refusal to cheapen the truth by turning it into a battle of egos. The family gatherings now felt different. Not perfect, but honest. The pedestal was gone. No one was idealized anymore. Everyone was simply human, capable of mistakes, capable of growth. And for the first time in my life, I felt equal in my own family. Not because I had proven anything, not because Daniel had been vindicated, but because the illusion that once governed us had collapsed. What replaced it wasn't celebration, it was clarity. By the time the legal process reached its final stage, the drama had already drained itself of spectacle. There were no more surprises left, only conclusions. The sentencing happened on a gray morning in early fall. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. No reporters, no audience beyond those directly involved. Ryan stood beside his attorney, no longer the man my parents once admired, but someone reduced to facts and findings. Charges were read, evidence summarized, consequences assigned. When it was over, there was no sense of victory in the room, just finality. Emily didn't look back as she left. My parents sat still for a long moment after everyone else stood. My father's shoulders were slumped, as if something heavy had finally been set down. My mother reached for his hand without speaking. Daniel waited patiently beside me, giving them time they hadn't known they would need. On the drive home, no one spoke, and for once the silence felt right. In the weeks that followed, life didn't return to normal because normal had been built on something false. Instead, we built something smaller, quieter, more honest. My parents sold their house and downsized. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to simplify. They stopped hosting large gatherings. They invited us over for simple dinners, where conversation centered on daily life rather than achievements. When Daniel spoke, it wasn't to explain or justify, it was to participate. Emily moved forward slowly. She started therapy. She enrolled in classes she'd once postponed for Ryan's ambitions. Some days she sounded hopeful, other days exhausted. But she was no longer performing certainty for anyone. One evening, months later, we all sat together, just the five of us. No tension, no unspoken hierarchies. My father looked at Daniel across the table. You know, he said we spent years praising the wrong things. Daniel nodded gently. Most people do. My mother added quietly. We thought loud meant strong. Daniel smiled faintly. Sometimes it just means loud. There was no bitterness in his voice. No trace of, I told you so. That absence spoke louder than any accusation ever could have. Later that night, after we said our goodbyes, Daniel and I walked home under the streetlights. The air was cool, calm. Do you feel like this is justice? I asked him. He thought for a long moment before answering. I think this is resolution, he said. Justice is quieter than people expect. I understood what he meant. Justice wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't Ryan's downfall. It was the way truth had finally settled into our lives, unchallenged, unargued, undeniable. I thought back to all the dinners where Daniel had been ignored, all the moments I'd felt small for choosing him, all the times silence had felt like weakness. I had been wrong. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be strength, waiting can be power, and dignity doesn't need witnesses to exist. My parents didn't become perfect. Emily didn't become suddenly healed. Our family still carried scars. But something fundamental had changed. No one worshipped anyone anymore. And in that absence, we all stood a little straighter. That night, as Daniel and I sat together in our quiet apartment, I realized something else. The man my parents once ridiculed had never needed their approval to be whole. He had known his value long before they ever questioned it. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't lift him above anyone else. It simply placed him where he had always belonged. If this story made you think about the quiet strength in your own life, or the people you may have underestimated, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe stories about patience, truth, and late arriving justice deserve space, consider subscribing. You're welcome here.